Have you ever loved someone so much that it terrified you? The kind of love that feels fragile, like one wrong word could break everything you've built? If you're tired, doubting, or feeling like real love might not be meant for you, this video is for you. Because my first year in Denmark taught me something brutal and beautiful. Love doesn't grow on its own. It grows because we choose it, especially on the days when it feels impossible. The first look in Denmark. Imagine this. You're dragging a suitcase that feels heavier than your entire past, stepping out of Copenhagen airport, and the cold Danish air hits you like it's trying to test your worth. And then just when you're too tired to care, you lift your head. Time doesn't stop, but it definitely stumbles. Because someone is looking at you with a calm, steady softness that makes your heartbeat forget its schedule. That was my first moment in Denmark. No dramatic music. No cinematic slow motion, no magical snowfall. Just a pair of eyes that made me feel seen in a country where I didn't even know how to pronounce certain street names. Denmark felt intimidating at first. The minimalist fashion, the quiet people, the sky that looked permanently undecided. But somehow his gaze felt warm enough to make all of that blur in the background. You know that feeling, right? When your brain says, "Let's calm down, this is nothing." But your heart whispers, "Yeah, but look again." And I did look again. Science says the human brain only needs 0.1 seconds to decide whether someone feels safe or not. Maybe that's why, even though I didn't know his name, didn't know his voice, didn't know whether he even noticed I was freezing to death, I still felt like I had just stepped into something important. I tried to act normal. You know, very composed, very adult, I'm totally fine living in a foreign country alone. Meanwhile, internally, my thoughts were sprinting around like toddlers on sugar. And the funny part? I wasn't thinking about the cultural differences that would later confuse us, or the miscommunications that would make us argue, or the doubts that almost ended everything. In that moment, all I knew was that something had begun, even if I couldn't name it yet. Much later, he told me he noticed me instantly too. But he didn't say anything because, in his words, "You looked like someone who needed personal space, and maybe a blanket." Which honestly is the most Danish flirt I've ever heard. But that tiny moment, barely a few seconds, changed my entire first year in Denmark. It opened a door I didn't even know I was standing in front of. A door that led to a love I wasn't planning for. A love I wasn't sure I knew how to handle. And a love that would later test me in ways soft eyes at an airport could never warn me about. Sometimes love doesn't begin with certainty. Sometimes it begins with a glance that feels too gentle to ignore. And life loves to mess with us using moments exactly like that. Love in a foreign land. There's a strange kind of magic in falling in love far from home. It's like your heart suddenly forgets its native language and tries to improvise something new. Living in Denmark felt exactly like that. Half excitement, half confusion, and a whole lot of, "What am I even doing here?" Yet somehow, in the middle of unfamiliar streets, unfamiliar skies, and unfamiliar versions of myself, the feelings I had for him grew louder than the loneliness. Picture this. A small cafe in Aarhus, the kind with candles lit even in the afternoon because Danish winter insists on turning everything into a moody movie set. He sat across from me, sipping coffee like it was a personality trait, while I tried to pretend I wasn't memorizing every detail of him. His laugh was soft, almost shy, like he was afraid to disturb the peace around him. And maybe that was why it stood out, because it made me feel like the world wasn't as quiet as I thought. Being in a foreign country already makes you hyper-aware of everything. You notice how people hold doors, how buses arrive on time like they're contractually obligated, how the air smells different after the rain. But falling for someone there? That makes the details sharper. I started noticing the way he always walks slightly slower beside me, as if adjusting to my pace. Or how he really listened when I talked about my family back home, even when my words tangled themselves trying to explain things that don't translate well in Europe. There was something grounding about him. Something steady like a lighthouse in a place where I constantly felt lost. And yet, loving in a foreign land is not romantic the way movies sell it. It's messy. It's terrifying. It's that moment when you realize you're putting your heart in the hands of someone who doesn't share your childhood, your weather, your traditions, or your instinctive ways of showing affection. You fear being misunderstood. You fear being too much, or too little, or just wrong in ways you can't predict. But here's the strange part. That very fear made everything feel real. More honest. More intentional. We weren't just two people from two countries. We were two people trying to meet in the middle of our differences. Even when we didn't know where the middle was. There was a sweetness in that effort, a tenderness in the way we tried to understand each other's small habits. I learned that he loved silence not because he was cold, but because silence to him was a kind of care. And he learned that I loved warmth not because I was needy, but because warmth to me was a kind of home. And maybe that's what falling in love in a foreign land truly is, building a tiny home inside someone even when the world outside still feels unfamiliar. Our first falling apart. Here's the thing no one tells you about loving someone from another world. The first cracks don't appear in big dramatic fights. They show up quietly, almost politely, like Denmark itself. One misunderstanding here, one mismatched expectation there, and suddenly the warmth you've been holding on to starts slipping through your fingers. That's exactly how our first falling apart began. Not with shouting, but with silence. It happened around the time the days started shrinking. If you've never lived through a Danish winter, imagine the sun deciding it's on part-time hours and the sky turning into a permanent gray screensaver. Your emotions get weird under that light. Heavy, slow, unfiltered. I didn't know that back then. I only knew that something between us felt off. He was quieter than usual and I was louder than usual. Not in volume but in need. I needed reassurance, warmth, tiny gestures. Meanwhile, he needed space, clarity, and time to think, 3 things I misinterpreted as distance. There was one night that changed everything. I asked him if something was wrong, and he paused, just paused, trying to find the right words. But my mind filled the silence before he could. In my culture, silence usually means something is cracking. In his, silence means, I'm choosing my words carefully because this matters. But of course I didn't know that. So I panicked. It's funny how the brain can turn into a conspiracy theorist when it feels threatened. Mine started whispering, he's pulling away. You're losing him. Say something before it's too late. So I did what anxious hearts do best. I tried to fix a problem I didn't understand. And in the process I created one. He thought I didn't trust him. I thought he didn't love me enough to speak. He felt pressured. I felt abandoned. It was like watching two different languages collide without translation. And the worst part? We both genuinely cared, we just didn't know how to care in the same way. Science says that when you're emotionally attached to someone, your brain reacts to their silence the same way it reacts to physical danger. No wonder I felt like I was losing oxygen every time he looked down instead of meeting my eyes. Meanwhile, he later told me he felt like he was failing me simply because he didn't express love the way I expected. And just like that, the first break happened. Not dramatic, not loud. Just a slow unraveling of two people who didn't yet understand how to hold each other without losing themselves. Looking back, it wasn't the falling apart that hurt the most. It was realizing that love can be so fragile when both hearts are still learning how to speak the same emotional language. The conversation that saved us. If you've ever held your breath through a relationship, waiting for the moment everything finally collapses, you know how terrifying it is when that moment actually arrives. For us, it happened on a night so quiet that even the radiator seemed afraid to make noise. We were sitting on opposite ends of the couch, not touching, not talking, just existing near each other like two people rehearsing for a breakup neither of us wanted. It's strange how silence can be louder than shouting. My chest felt tight, like my body already knew something was slipping away. There's a psychological term for it: threat response activation. The moment your brain senses emotional danger and prepares for loss. That was me. Every thought sharp, every heartbeat loud, every word stuck. He looked like he was carrying a weight too heavy to name. And somewhere between us was everything we weren't saying. Finally, he whispered, "I don't want to lose you." Just 7 words, but they cracked something open inside me. Not because they were perfect, but because his voice was trembling in that quiet Danish way, controlled, soft, but undeniably real. That I didn't respond right away. My instinct was to protect myself, to guard the bruised parts of me that had been aching for weeks. But then I remembered something painfully human. No love survives if both people are only trying to win. So I took a breath, shaky, embarrassing, and said the thing I had been afraid to admit. "I'm scared. I don't always understand you. And I think you don't understand me either." That was the moment everything shifted. His shoulders dropped like my honesty had given him permission to finally be honest too. He told me he wasn't pulling away. He was overwhelmed. He told me he needed time to think before speaking because he didn't want to hurt me. He told me that my intensity didn't scare him. It confused him, but it didn't push him away. And then he said something I'll never forget. "I'm not quiet because I don't care. I'm quiet because I care too much." And suddenly the puzzle made sense. His silence wasn't rejection, it was fear. His calmness wasn't coldness, it was protection. His distance wasn't distance, it was him trying to love me in the only way he knew how. We talked for hours that night. Slowly, softly, sometimes messily, sometimes with tears we pretended not to wipe away. We explained things we should have explained months earlier. We admitted fears we didn't know how to name. By the time the sky started turning a shy shade of winter blue, we were sitting close enough that our knees touched. Something small but big enough to say, "We're trying again." There's a kind of healing that only happens when two people finally understand each other's language. Not the spoken one, but the emotional one. That night didn't fix everything, but it saved us. And sometimes that's enough. The warmth behind his silence. Here's something no one warns you about when you fall in love with someone who grew up in a completely different emotional climate. You will misunderstand their silence long before you understand their heart. And I did, over and over again. For the longest time, I thought his quietness meant he was drifting away. But the truth? His silence was the warmest language he knew, and I just didn't know how to read it yet. Imagine sitting beside someone who barely says a word, yet somehow their presence feels steadier than every promise you've ever heard. That was him. He wasn't the type to say, "I miss you," or "I'm thinking about you 5 times a day." Sometimes he didn't even text back right away. And my mind, trained in a culture where care is expressed through constant communication, went straight into emotional detective mode. I'd replay our conversations, analyze his tone, try to decode the microscopic details. Meanwhile, he was probably sipping tea, thinking everything was perfectly fine. One evening changed everything for me. We were sitting by the window, watching the kind of Danish rain that looks like it's falling in slow motion. I asked him why he rarely talked about his feelings. Not accusing, just tired. He thought for a long moment, the way he always does, then said something that felt like a key turning inside a lock. "When I'm quiet with you," he said softly, "it means I feel safe." Safe. That word hit me like a warm shock. All this time I'd been reading his silence as distance, when in his world silence was intimacy. In Denmark, people don't speak to fill space. They speak when something matters. They don't perform emotions. They reveal them slowly, like unfolding a letter by hand. Suddenly, everything made sense. The gentle way he'd put a cup of tea next to me without saying a word. The way he always walked on the outside of the sidewalk. The way he never rushed me, even when he was late. His love wasn't loud, but it was precise. It was thoughtful. It was consistent. Psychologists call this low expressive affection. A style of love where emotions are shown through actions, not declarations. It's common in Scandinavian cultures, but for someone like me, who grew up in a place where emotions spill out like sunlight, it felt foreign at first. I used to crave words, but slowly I began to crave something else. The quiet certainty he gave me without speaking. I realized that warmth doesn't always come wrapped in sentences. Sometimes it comes wrapped in presence, gentle, patient, and steady. Sometimes the person who says the least ends up loving you with the most intention. And once you learn to understand someone's silence, you stop fearing it. Winter that changed everything. If you've never lived through a Danish winter, let me paint it for you. Imagine the sun hitting the snooze button for 3 months straight, the wind personally offended by your existence, and the darkness creeping in at 3:30 p.m. like it owns the place. It's the kind of season that doesn't just test your mood. It tests your relationship. And ours was no exception. There's a psychological phenomenon called seasonal emotional load, where long periods of darkness amplify every emotion you already have. If you're happy, you get reflective. If you're sad, you sink deeper. And if you're in love, well, winter asks you a simple but brutal question. Is this real or just convenient? That winter we had to answer it. The cold forced us indoors more often, which meant we spent hours together. Hours where there was no distraction, no sunshine, no world outside to soften the edges between us. It was just him, me, and the quiet apartment lit by little candles that Danes insist on using even at breakfast. I swear Denmark invented cozy as a defense mechanism. At first, the darkness amplified every insecurity I had. I overthought everything he said, and everything he didn't. Some nights, the silence between us felt so loud it echoed. But something unexpected started happening too. Without the noise of the outside world, we began noticing each other in a different way. He'd wrap a blanket around my shoulders without saying a word. I'd make him ginger tea because he always forgot to warm his hands. He'd read while leaning against me, like my presence was the most natural background in his life, and those tiny things, smaller than whispers, became the foundation of something stronger. One night in particular is etched into me like frost on glass. The wind was howling against the windows, and we were sitting on the couch under the same blanket, our legs tangled in that quiet, unthinking way that only happens when two people have stopped pretending. He looked at me with this soft, steady expression like he was memorizing me, not because he was afraid to lose me, but because he finally felt certain. "You make winter feel shorter," he said. Just 5 words, but coming from him it felt like poetry. In Denmark, affection isn't theatrical. It shows up in whispers, in gestures, in half-sentences that carry entire universes. And in that small, quiet moment I realized something big. Love doesn't grow the most in the bright seasons. It grows in the cold ones, in the darkness, in the doubt, in the slow days where you choose each other not because it's easy, but because it's the only thing that feels warm. That winter didn't break us, it shaped us. It taught us that love doesn't need heat to survive, just 2 hearts willing to keep each other lit, choosing each other daily. Love isn't a single grand gesture. It isn't a declaration shouted from rooftops or fireworks exploding in your chest. At least not the kind that lasts. What keeps 2 people together? Especially in a foreign land, in a winter that feels like it wants to swallow you whole, is the quiet daily choice to stay. And that's exactly what we learned, to choose each other every single day, even when it felt inconvenient or uncomfortable. Some days choosing him meant listening without interrupting when he spoke slowly, carefully about things I didn't immediately understand. Other days it meant not overreacting when I felt ignored or misread, because I knew his love was in his actions, not just his words. Psychologists call this intentional commitment, the kind that grows stronger when both partners consistently put effort into understanding and supporting each other. And let me tell you, it works in very tiny but profoundly meaningful ways. I started noticing patterns I hadn't seen before. The way he always left a mug for me when he got up for work. The way he'd take extra time adjusting his scarf to make sure I stayed warm. The small pauses he gave me when I was anxious. The subtle touches that said, I'm here. And me? I learned to reciprocate, not with grand speeches but with steady, deliberate actions. Cooking meals when he was tired, sending him little notes, just showing up fully for him. There were times it was exhausting. Love is not always light and effortless, especially when two people are learning how to bridge entirely different emotional languages. But here's the thing. Choosing someone every day, even in the monotony, even in the quiet struggles, builds a foundation stronger than any fleeting passion. It creates a rhythm of trust and care that can survive winters, misunderstandings, and life's inevitable chaos. Sometimes I'd catch myself thinking, I could walk away today and it would be easier. But then he'd do something so small, so intentional, pour me coffee just the way I like it, or leave a note in my coat pocket, that I remembered why I chose him in the first place. And the truth hit me. Love is not a one-time decision. It's hundreds of tiny decisions stacked together, and eventually, they form something unshakable. To be why the end of that first year. We weren't just surviving together in Denmark. We were thriving, not because everything was perfect, but because we had learned to actively, intentionally, and consistently choose each other. And that, I realized, is what makes love grow. What love really needs to grow. After that first year in Denmark, I finally understood something that no one had ever explained to me so clearly. Real love doesn't need fireworks, grand gestures, or perfect timing. It needs courage, patience, and the willingness to show up even when it's hard. Love grows not in moments of perfection, but in the small, deliberate choices we make for each other every single day. We learned that honesty is the soil where love takes root. Saying what you feel, even when it's awkward, messy, or scary, plants seeds of trust. Choosing to stay present, even when emotions run high or silence stretches too long, waters those seeds. And giving space when the other needs it, that's the sunlight. It doesn't feel dramatic, but it's essential. One night, I remember sitting by the window as the Danish wind rattled the panes, thinking about everything we had been through. All the quiet misunderstandings, the small gestures that felt monumental, the moments where we could have given up but didn't. I realized that love isn't just about finding someone who understands your language perfectly. It's about learning to read each other's hearts. Even when the words are few, the culture is different, and the world outside is dark. There's a psychological reason why relationships survive and thrive when couples engage in daily acts of kindness and understanding. It rewires the brain to recognize security, trust, and connection. It's slow, subtle, almost invisible, but over time, it builds something that feels unshakable. That's exactly what happened with us. Every small act, every gentle pause, every shared silence, those tiny things compounded into something extraordinary. So what does love really need to grow? Courage to be honest, patience to wait, and consistency in choosing each other, day after day. That first year in Denmark taught me that love is less about perfect moments and more about showing up, quietly and faithfully, for someone who matters. It's about learning their silence, understanding their gestures, and letting your hearts communicate in ways words can't always reach. And if there's one thing I hope you take from our story, it's this: love can survive anything if both hearts are willing to learn, adapt, and choose each other. even in the coldest, darkest winters.